Harry Anslinger was commissioner of the U.S. Narcotics Bureau for 32 years, and what he brought to the war on drugs in those 3 decades is still being felt today. Well, to talk about this, we welcome Johann Hari. He is the author of Chasing the Scream, the first and last days of the war on drugs. Hello and welcome to the agenda.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're going to get into your book, which is a real page turner, but I want to begin by just reading a passage from your book, so just bear with me, it's a bit long. Here we go. Almost 100 years after the start of the war on drugs, I found myself stuck on one of its more minor battlefields. In the suburbs of North London, one of my closest relatives had been rock bottoming on cocaine again, while my ex-boyfriend was ending his long East London romance with heroin and picking up a crack pipe instead. I was watching all this with some distance, in part because I'd been swallowing fistfuls of white narcolepsy pills for years. I'm not a narcoleptic. All this felt like home to me. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake one of my relatives from a drugged slump and not being able to. Ever since, I've been oddly drawn to addicts and recovering addicts. They feel like my tribe, my group, my people. But now, for the first time, I was beginning to wonder if I had become an addict myself. Now, Johann, this book is not about you, but it is a personal book, as we heard there. What made you want to just lay yourself bare?
You know, I realised we were coming up to 100 years since drugs were first banned. And as it says there, I was looking at these people who had addiction problems who I loved. And I realised there were just loads of really basic questions that I didn't know the answer to about this. I regarded myself as a fairly well-informed person, but I realised I didn't know, why did we start going to war against drug users and drug addicts? Why do we carry on when it so clearly doesn't work? What are the alternatives in practice? And what really causes drug use and drug addiction? So I decided I wanted to go on a journey to find. I didn't want to. Part of the problem with this issue, I think, is we talk about it in such an abstract way, like we're at a philosophy seminar. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to go and meet real people whose lives have been changed one way or another by these policies. So I ended up going on this journey that took me across 9 countries, 30,000 miles, and meeting this incredible range of people, from a transsexual crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to a scientist who spends a lot of time feeding hallucinogens to mongooses to see what happens, to the only country that's ever decriminalised all drugs from cannabis to crack. And the thing that most struck me is almost everything we think we know about this subject is wrong. Drugs aren't what we think they are. Addiction isn't what we think it is. The drug war is not what we think it is. And the alternatives to the drug war are not what we think they are. So it was kind of exciting and mind-boggling.
And you brought yourself into it because this was your experience. You'd been surrounded by this.
I thought it was important to tell the readers why, although there's very little about me in the book, I thought it was important to tell the readers why I cared enough to go on this really long 3.5-year-long journey, and to kind of understand my emotional investment in it.
I want to spend just a little more time talking about you, then we'll talk more about the content of the book. And that has to do with your past, which you knew I was going to bring up. I want to ask you about the plagiarism scandal. So people who don't know you, you're a very highly regarded columnist at The Independent, and you use quotes in your articles that you took from other journalists who had interviewed the same person. You changed some journalists' citations in Wikipedia under a pseudonym. You're caught, you're suspended, you eventually quit. And I'm curious, because this is personal. What have you learned from that experience about why you did it, and what have you learned about yourself?
I think when you screw up, you should encourage people to see it from the point of view of the people you harm, not from your own point of view. And the people I harmed were the people I was nasty about, the readers of The Independent who deserved me to be more direct about where I was coming from and to be transparent in a way that I wasn't, and from The Independent itself, which was a fantastic newspaper, and I harmed. So I'm very reluctant to kind of tell a story about myself, because I think if you do that, you're trying to encourage people to see it from your point of view and inevitably be sympathetic to you, and I don't want to do that as a way of trying to get out of my responsibility and my guilt for doing something wrong. So I don't want to do that. What I did learn, when there were lots of things I learned from the experience, but one of the things I really want to do with this book is just be maximally transparent. So there's more than 400 quotes that were said directly to me. They're all on the website, chasingthescream.com. People can listen to them. As you're reading the book, you can kind of hear the people talking to you, which I think is a kind of cool thing anyway. You know, there's, I forget how many pages, but about 80 pages of footnotes explaining where everything's from. It's a really transparent book, which I think is why such a diverse range of people who don't lend their reputations lightly, you know, endorse the book, from the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald to Naomi Klein to the former chief scientific advisor on drugs to the British government, to the former head of the Los Angeles Police Department drug squad. So a really broad range of people. So I feel like it's a book people can really have confidence in.
Were you on drugs when you were doing all that nefarious stuff? Because we talked about you being on drugs and we talked about your plagiarism. Is there a connection between the two?
No, I did it before I was using the drugs and while I was using them. So there's absolutely no, I take complete responsibility for what I did wrong, and it was not the result of the drug use at all.
Okay, let's get into the book itself.
Sure.
It's called Chasing the Scream. What does that refer to?
The most influential man no one's ever heard of is a guy called Hari Anslinger. He took over the Department of Prohibition just as alcohol prohibition is ending. He was a government bureaucrat. And he's got this big department full of corrupt agents with nothing really to do. And he invented the modern drug war to keep this department in business. And he was really driven by two really strong hatreds, a hatred of addicts and a hatred of African Americans. And the story you referred to is a story right from his start. When he's 10, or I think it might be 11, he grew up in a place called Altoona in Pennsylvania, rural Pennsylvania, and when drugs were legal. And near where he lived, there was a farmer whose wife was an addict. And one day he went there, and the wife was in a state of distress. She was screaming, and the farmer said, take the horse and cart, go as quick as you can to the pharmacy, buy her some opiates. So he didn't really understand what that meant, but he goes there as quick as he can. He goes in, he buys it, he comes back, he gives it to the wife, he gives the drugs to the wife, she takes them, she recovers. But he remembered this as a profoundly traumatic experience. And I think in a way he was like chasing that scream across the world. He was determined from that point on to physically eradicate these drugs from the world. The tragedy of Hari Anslinger is he created a lot more screams in his turn.
Okay, I want to keep talking about him, but I just want to pick up on something you just said. Before, the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, drugs are flowing freely. There's no rules, there's no war on drugs, there's no laws about them. They're just flowing freely. It's
really hard to reconstruct. If you wanted to buy opiates, you would go to your local pharmacy. You could buy cocaine-based products. Harrods, the British department store, sold a heroin hamper, which you could send to people. There were problems. It was rather analogous to alcoholism today. There would be people who had alcohol problems. But what's fascinating is the official studies from the time show addicts, people who were using opiates and cocaine were no more likely to be criminals than anyone else. They overwhelmingly had jobs. They were no more likely to be sex workers or any of those things. That actually, it's very fascinating I tell it through the story of this extraordinary doctor in California, Henry Smith Williams. Who was not very sympathetic to addicts, but he treated addicts before, when drugs were legal, and then as the drug war comes in. And what he found is suddenly all sorts of problems that didn't exist before suddenly flood in.
So let me bring Anslinger into this, because what evidence did he have then that drug use is going to cause social problems? You say before this there wasn't really a lot of evidence of that on the ground.
It's such an important question, because actually, if you'd said to me why were drugs banned, right? I would have assumed it would be because it caused social problems, because they were worried that kids would use drugs, or they were worried about addiction. Actually, that's a really minor part of the debate. When I went and looked through his archives and read everything from the time that I could find from the time, it was overwhelmingly a completely different cause that we don't think about now, although it's still very relevant to the drug war. It was founded in a race panic. Hari Anslinger and a huge number of people at the time were convinced African Americans and Chinese Americans were using drugs, forgetting their place and attacking white people. You read the stuff at the time and it is shocking. The official statements like, the cocaine N-word sure is hard to kill. This belief, of course we know that African Americans were angry because they were being treated appallingly. And the way I tell the story in the book mainly is through the story of how Hari Anslinger stalked and helped to kill Billie Holiday. Story that blew me away when I found it out, and I went and interviewed a lot of her friends and tracked down whoever I could find. That in 1939, Billie Holiday stands on stage in New York City and she sings the song Strange Fruit, which a lot of people watching will know is a song against lynching. Her goddaughter Lorraine Feather said to me, you've got to understand how shocking it is to have an African-American woman standing up in front of a white audience singing a song about lynching. Billie Holiday wasn't even allowed to walk through the front door of that hotel. She had to go through the service elevator. And that night, according to her biographer Julia Blackburn, Hari Anslinger's agents say to Billie Holiday, stop singing this song.
Go ahead. Because she was on drugs, right?
She was a heroin addict. She had grown up in Baltimore when it was a segregated city and she wasn't allowed in a lot of places. And she had promised herself she was never going to bow her head to any white man. And the Federal Bureau of Narcotics is very interesting. Around the time that Hari Anslinger finds out Billie Holiday is a heroin addict, he finds out Judy Garland is a heroin addict, Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. He tells her to take slightly longer vacations and tells her she's going to be fine. Billie Holiday gets treated very differently. Harry Anslinger hated employing African Americans, but he couldn't really send a white guy into Harlem to stalk Billie Holiday. It'd be kind of obvious. So he employs an African American agent called Jimmy Fletcher, who follows her around for 2 years, stalks her everywhere. Actually, Billie Holiday was so amazing, he fell in love with her. And his whole life, he felt ashamed of what he did. He busts her, she's put on trial. She said the trial was called the United States versus Billie Holiday, and that's how it felt. She's sent to prison. When she gets out, this is the most awful part, there's very few places she can perform because you needed a cabaret performer's license to perform anywhere where alcohol was served, and Anslinger makes sure she doesn't get it. Her friend Yolanda Bavan said to me, what is the cruelest thing you can do to a person? It's to take away the thing they love. Billie Holiday can't sing. You know, she can find very few places. She relapses on addiction, which is in her early 40s, she collapses, and she's taken to a hospital in New York, and they turn her away because she's an addict. She's taken to another hospital. She's convinced that Anslinger's men aren't finished with her. She says to one of her friends, they're going to kill me in there. Don't let them, they're going to kill me. She's diagnosed with liver cancer. They handcuff her to the bed. I interviewed the last surviving person, an amazing man called Eugene Callender, who was in the room. They don't let her friends in to see her. They take away her candies, her record player. One of her friends, because she goes into heroin withdrawal, manages to insist that she's given methadone. She starts to recover. They cut off the methadone and she died. One of her friends said she looked like she had been violently wrenched from life, she told the BBC. But the thing that most helped me in this story about Billie Holiday, to think about the addicts in my life, is actually how heroic it was. You know, whatever they did to her, she always found somewhere to sing that song. She kept the promise she'd made back in Baltimore. She didn't bow her head to anyone. But it really shows the dynamics of the birth of the drug war, the way that race carries all the way through. African Americans are no more likely to use or sell drugs than any other ethnic group. They make up the overwhelming majority of people who go to prison for it. And I tell that story as it develops later. You know, this is founded in a race panic, and it continues in a race panic.
That's amazing. So it was a racist crusade by Anslinger. This was his whole agenda.
It's fascinating. It was a very significant part. I wouldn't say it was the whole agenda, but it was a massive part of it. You know, this is a guy who was regarded as a crazy racist by the crazy racists in the 1930s, a man who used the N-word so often in police memos that his own senator said he should have to resign. This is really deep at the core of the drug war. And it really continues. I quote in the book a police officer in Washington, D.C. called Matthew Fogg, who explained in a speech, one day he went to his boss and said something like, hey boss, how come when we do drug raids we only ever go to the black neighborhoods? I'm pretty sure white people use drugs as well. And his boss said something like, the exact quote is in the book, you're right, but white people get lawyers and they know judges and they know journalists. We go for the low-hanging fruit. And you really see that. If you've got a law that is broken by half of the population, as the drug laws have been, you can't arrest half of the population, although to be fair, the Americans are doing their best to try. So what are you going to do? You're going to go after the most unpopular and despised groups. You know, so even when they're not consciously racist, and I interviewed some police officers, heroic police officers, who were not consciously racist, the effect ends up being racist.
So Anslinger had an agenda. I mean, was he alone in this, or how widely believed were they, his views?
Oh, it's really important to understand. I don't believe in the great man theory of history. Harry Anslinger could only do this because he was conducting much wider fears and anxieties that were in the society. Harry Anslinger, I think of as kind of like, he was a genius at building a lightning conductor over his department, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and convincing everyone that their anxiety should run through his department. And if you think about that in terms of marijuana, he had initially, when he becomes the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, said he didn't really have a problem with marijuana. He didn't think it was particularly difficult. He certainly didn't regard it as like a dangerous drug. Then he kind of realizes heroin and cocaine, they're not that big in America. You're not going to keep a big department going like that. So he latches onto a case of a boy called Victor Licata. He was a boy in Florida who was in, I believe, his early 20s. Victor Licata hacked his family to death with an axe. And Harry Anslinger announces that this was the result of him smoking marijuana. This is what will happen if you use marijuana. The Hearst newspapers, which was like the Fox News of its day, massively goes on this story. It's huge, and that's the context in which marijuana is banned. Years later, as I explain in the book, someone goes back and checks the psychiatric records of Victor Licata. There's not even any evidence he used marijuana. His family had congenital insanity. They'd been advised to put him in a sanitarium years before, and they'd refused. You know, but again, we still live with the ban that's born in this hysteria and this lunacy.
Well, one of the other things I wanted to ask you was the resistance. So Anslinger does this, you know, drug war. He goes on this crusade. Is there resistance to it? Are there people pushing back saying This guy's a nutball.
This is so fascinating to me, and I had no idea about it until I started doing this research. The drug war was not introduced lightly. There was massive and sustained resistance for years. Most fascinating example are from doctors. When the drug war is introduced, when drugs are first criminalised in 1914, there's a very specific loophole written into the law. They said this doesn't apply to addicts. Addicts can go to the doctor and get what they need. We're talking about recreational users, right? And this loophole remains in place, and it's shut down by Anslinger, and it's shut down state by state. And doctors, they had to arrest 20,000 doctors because doctors insisted on carrying on. The mayor of Los Angeles stands in front of a heroin prescribing clinic, a clinic where heroin is given to addicts, and says, you will not close this down. You know, this was really, he was a popularly elected mayor. And Anslinger really goes to war against it. And there's this doctor who, as I described, Henry Smith Williams, an incredible man, who wrote a book right at the start of the drug war called Drug Addicts Are Human Beings, which is this weirdly prophetic book. At one point he says, obviously we wouldn't do this, but if we were so foolish as to carry on pursuing this policy for 50 years, 50 years from now we'll have a $5 billion smuggling industry in the United States. He was right to almost the exact year. And Anslinger goes to war against that doctor, this man who wrote this prescient book. He has him destroyed, he has his brother destroyed, he has all these people broken. One of the people who worked for Anslinger said something like, the exact words are in the book, you know, he had to decapitate anyone who disagreed with him. He actually gets the police, claims this guy is linked to drug smuggling. Henry Smith Williams was fascinating though, the doctor, because he stumbled across this theory. When they shut it down state by state, they did it differently in different states, it took longer. And he discovered why they did it in California. There was a trial. It turned out the Chinese drug gangs in California were really annoyed that in Nevada, where the doctors had been shut down, if you were a heroin addict, you had to come to the Chinese drug gangs to buy your drugs. But in California, you could go to your doctor. So they bribed the Federal Bureau of Narcotics agents in California to introduce the drug war, to crack down, because that meant that people couldn't go to the doctor, they had to go to the Chinese drug gangs, and they got all the money. Right at the birth of the drug war, criminals are literally paying for it to be introduced.
Wow.
The only people who have ever won from the war on drugs are armed criminal gangs. They have won $1 trillion bonanza.
Well, I want to ask you about that, because we don't talk much about drugs anymore without talking about organized crime when we have these discussions. And I want you to talk about a particular individual. We're going to bring his picture up, a guy named Arnold Rothstein. Just remind our viewers who he was.
Arnold Rothstein invented modern drug dealing. So when you ban drugs, they don't disappear. Anyone watching this knows that. They're transferred from doctors and pharmacists to armed criminal gangs. And Arnold Rothstein was like the most famous gangster of the Jazz age. He's probably remembered best. He massively kind of spreads illegal gambling. He rigged a lot of things. He's probably best remembered because he rigged the 1919 World Series. He bribed one of the gangs to, one of the teams to, shows how well I understand American sports. He bribed one of the teams to throw the match, and he won a fortune in the gambling. But he really saw that first alcohol prohibition and then drug prohibition were going to be an absolutely massive market. And it's really fascinating. I learned from both studying Arnold Rothstein and then from spending a lot of time with a transsexual former crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn called Chino Hardin, really how a prohibited market works. The best way to explain it is, if you or me after this show go to a local liquor store and we try to steal the beer or the vodka, they're going to call the police and they're going to take us away, right? So they don't need to be violent or intimidating or threatening. If we go up to the local weed dealer or coke dealer and we try to steal their product, obviously they can't call the police would arrest them. They have to be violent and intimidating. Indeed, they don't want to be having a fight every day, so they have to establish a reputation for being so frightening and intimidating that no one will dare to come and steal them. They have to commit theatrical acts of violence and intimidation. You see this with Rothstein. I saw it with Chino on a much smaller level on her block. I saw it in northern Mexico when I interviewed one of the only people to ever make it out of the deadliest Mexican drug cartel and live to tell their story. What it creates is what the sociologist Philippe Bourgeois calls a culture of terror. You have to be terrifying. Or actually, a writer called Charles Bowden said, the war on drugs creates a war for drugs. These gangs fight for it. Where are the violent alcohol dealers? They don't exist. They existed under alcohol prohibition. It's really important for people to understand this is nothing to do with drugs. It's nothing to do, it's not like, you know, some people talk about drug-related violence, which makes it sound as if people took drugs and went and attacked someone. That's no more, you know, Al Capone wasn't alcohol-related violence. He wasn't getting drunk and going and killing someone. This is prohibition that drives this violence. Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, calculated there are 10,000 additional murders every year in the United States as a result of drug prohibition, which are drug gangs killing each other and people getting caught in the prohibition. This is not a trivial amount of violence. This destroys whole neighborhoods. Here in Canada too.
And we're going to talk about Canada tomorrow when I talk to you again. So Rothstein's just one of the guys who profits from the drug. He makes a gajillion dollars. He figures that I can monetize this. It turns into a business.
The funniest story about Arnold Rothstein, I thought, it's hard to reconstruct parts of Arnold Rothstein's story, except that his wife wrote this incredible memoir that was really hard to track down. He arranged a drug deal with a guy called Captain Alfred Lowenstein, who was the third richest man in the world. He was the Bill Gates of his day. He was a financier. He was so rich that when the Germans invaded Belgium, he offered to buy Belgium back from them. Gives you some idea how rich he was. And Rothstein met with him and did the biggest drug deal in history. They cut this deal. And then Lowenstein gets on a plane back to Europe. And when the plane lands, Lowenstein isn't there. The crew claim, oh, he went to the toilet and fell out. It doesn't seem terribly plausible. And Rothstein presumably got to keep all the money he made in this deal. So Rothstein was really above the law. Rothstein, he owned the NYPD. You read the accounts from the time. Police officers were more scared of him than they were of the NYPD commissioner. At one point, he shot at 2 NYPD detectives and was mysteriously acquitted. You know, this is something you see, and you really saw that when I went to northern Mexico, that dynamic on steroids. You know, I was shown around by a guy called Julian Cardona, who's the Reuters correspondent in Juarez. He's a fantastic journalist. And he kept introducing me to people who'd been killed by the police. And I said to him at some point, Julian, I need to meet people who've been killed by the cartels, not just people who've been killed by the police. And he just laughed and said, Johann, when the cartels want to kill someone, they pay the police to do it. Those aren't separate forces. The cartels own the police. That's exactly what began with Rothstein in the 20s. If you have a significant, if you think about a housing project here in Vancouver, if 5 or 10% of that housing project, the economy of it, was in the hands of drug dealers, right? That housing project would be an awful place to live. In Juarez, in northern Mexico, 70% of the economy is in the hands of armed criminal gangs. They can just outbid the state. They can own the police. They can own everyone.
You know, it's interesting, though, because the Rothsteins of the world, there are countless others, make money. But the drug trades, I mean, it's incredibly violent. It's an often short-lived experience for the people that are involved. And if you look around the world, laws are stiff against drug trafficking and so on and so forth. Why haven't either of those drawbacks been enough to deter people? I mean, is it because they're above the law?
Oh, to deter dealers?
Yeah.
Well, there are lots of people who are presumably deterred by the law, but at the end of the day, you've got an absolutely enormous trade. The markup from heroin being grown in Helmand province in Afghanistan to it being sold on the streets of Toronto is 6,000%, right? 6,000% profit margin is pretty tempting for anyone. So, and also, it's, you know, it's worth remembering, we can't keep drugs out of our prisons. And we've got a walled perimeter where we pay someone to walk around it the whole time. The odds of actually being caught are very, very slim because you'd have to have a police state to catch people. You can't keep them out of a prison. You certainly can't keep them out of Canada. So I don't think it really, I mean, there presumably are people who are deterred, but there's always going to be someone who's going to step in.
And let me pick up on that point, because, you know, there are more gangs, there's more ways more methods of violence around. I mean, are we just too far down the rabbit hole? Has this culture of violence that is linked to drugs around the world just too ingrained to ever be stopped? I mean, do the two just now go so hand in hand that we'll never break it apart?
Oh, no, not at all. It was incredibly deeply ingrained in Chicago during alcohol prohibition. Where are the violent alcohol dealers now? Does the liquor aisle at Walmart go and shoot the people who work in the local liquor store in the face? No, of course not. This is entirely the product of prohibition, not the product of... It's not that deeply ingrained. I mean, at the end of the day, it stopped with alcohol prohibition almost immediately. These people are responding to market incentives. It's not crazed psychopathy. It's, at the end of the day, they're being paid to do it, and that's how the prohibited market works.
I mean, the thing is after prohibition, it's not like the organized crime gangs went away. They still existed.
Well, they don't exist in the alcohol trade, and most people... Criminals respond to market incentives like anyone else. If there's a huge and lucrative industry that you can control in the illegal trade, people will go into it. If it's reclaimed by the legal trade, we don't have to talk theoretically. I went to Switzerland where they've legalized heroin for addicts. You know, where are the heroin dealers in Geneva? They're not there anymore. You know, the people you get your drugs from are doctors and pharmacists. You go to a clinic, not pharmacists, sorry, you go to a clinic and you can use heroin there, they'll give it to you. There are no violent heroin dealers in Geneva anymore because it's in the hands of a legal trade. You know, it's not, the violence is the product of prohibition.
We began our conversation talking about you, and you said everything that you had thought or, you know, didn't know about the war on drugs was challenged by this. And your book talks a lot about a lot of things you learned, but what are the key things, I mean, that we just have gotten so wrong about the war on drugs and addiction?
There's so many. The one that most blew my mind is that addiction is not what we think it is. And I was really startled by this. We've created a society where a lot of people feel so cut off, they can't bear to be present in their lives. They can't get through the day. It helped me to think about the addicts in my life, because a lot of how we're taught as a culture to think about addicts is to basically threaten the addicts in our lives, to cut them off. And God knows, there are times when I'm very angry with the addicts in my life and I feel the Harry Anslinger in my head raging. And you know that TV show Intervention that kind of says you should threaten them and say if they go to rehab, I'll cut you off? That is the worst thing you can do to an addict. If loss of connection is what is the worst driver of addiction, to threaten to cut them off is, you know, when I went back after learning about all this, and one thing I really resolved to do with the addicts in my life is to say to them, whether you are using or not, whether you are in a wreck or you're well, I will always love you, and I will always try to sit with you, and I will always try to listen to you. It's been widely reported, I'm not giving anything away, that David Cameron, my Prime Minister, had an addicted relative. Didn't ring the police, he got him nice rehab. That's exactly what we should want for everyone, what we would want for the people we love, which is compassion and care, because at the end of the day we know punishing and humiliating and stigmatizing addicts makes them worse. Loving them and helping them turn around their lives makes them better.
Seems pretty simple from what you say. It's not. We'll talk more. I know it's not. We're going to talk about Vancouver tomorrow, but thank you for introducing us to all these people. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.